The blueprint revisions for the downtown office complex covered my kitchen table. Red ink corrections marking structural modifications that would save the client $2 million in construction costs. I finished calculating the load-bearing adjustments for the 32nd floor, cross-referencing wind load specifications against the updated foundation design, when 3 sharp knocks echoed through my apartment. I'm Victoria Nash, and for the past 14 years, I've been a structural engineer specializing in high-rise construction. My consulting firm, Nash Engineering Solutions, has designed earthquake-resistant frameworks for buildings across the West Coast, including the 70-story tower that now dominated the city skyline 10 blocks from my apartment. But most people who knew me casually, including my landlord, thought I was just a tenant who worked from home doing computer stuff. The knocking continued, more insistent now. I glanced at the clock, 8:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. Not typical timing for maintenance issues or neighborly visits. I saved my work, closed the laptop, and walked to the front door. Through the peephole, I could see Harold Brennan, my landlord for the past 3 years, flanked by 2 men in dark suits who looked distinctly uncomfortable. Harold's usual rumpled appearance had been upgraded to what appeared to be a new jacket and tie, though the effect was somewhat undermined by his perpetually anxious expression. I opened the door, maintaining the polite but distant relationship we'd established since I'd moved into the Meridian Towers apartment complex. "Good evening, Harold. Is everything all right?" He shifted nervously, clearly rehearsing whatever speech he prepared. "Victoria, I need to discuss some changes to your lease agreement. May we come in?" The 2 men behind him said nothing, but their presence was obviously meant to convey authority or intimidation. I stepped aside to let them enter, curious about what had prompted this unusual evening visit. My apartment was spacious by city standards, 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. I'd chosen it specifically for the home office potential and the structural integrity of the building itself, having reviewed the original architectural plans before signing the lease. The rent was reasonable for the location, and Harold had been a hands-off landlord who generally avoided tenant interactions. "Can I offer anyone coffee or water?" I asked, gesturing toward the living room furniture. Harold declined, but one of his companions, a thin man with calculating eyes, surveyed my apartment with obvious assessment. He noted the expensive computer equipment, the engineering texts on the bookshelves, and the framed certificates from various professional organizations. "Victoria," Harold began, his voice carrying a forced confidence that didn't match his body language. "The real estate market has changed significantly since you signed your current lease. Property values in this area have increased dramatically." I nodded politely. Market appreciation was hardly news in a city where tech growth had been driving construction booms for years. My own projects had contributed to that growth, though Harold had no idea about the scope of my professional involvement in the district's development. "I understand market conditions can affect property values," I replied. "Is this about the lease renewal negotiations? I thought we weren't scheduled to discuss that until next month." The thin man stepped forward, clearly the source of Harold's newfound assertiveness. "I'm Gerald Hoffman from Hoffman Property Management. We've been consulting with Mr. Brennan about optimizing his portfolio's revenue potential." Ah, Harold had hired a property management company, probably lured by promises of increased rental income through aggressive tenant management. I'd seen this pattern before. Small landlords getting convinced to sacrifice stable, long-term tenants for short-term profit maximization. "The current rental rates for this building are significantly below market value," Hoffman continued. "We've identified substantial opportunities for revenue enhancement through strategic lease restructuring. Translation: they wanted to force out existing tenants to justify massive rent increases for new ones. It was a common gentrification strategy, though typically implemented with more legal finesse than this evening's intimidation approach. Harold cleared his throat. Victoria, your rent is increasing to $4,500 per month, effective immediately. If you can't agree to the new terms, we'll need you to vacate by tomorrow morning. I kept my expression neutral while processing the implications. My current rent was $1,500 monthly. They were proposing to triple it overnight. More significantly, they were attempting to implement this change outside normal lease procedures without proper notice or legal justification. That's quite an increase, I said calmly. May I see the legal documentation supporting this change? Hoffman's smile had sharp edges. Market conditions don't require extensive documentation. You can accept the new terms or find alternative housing. Given the current rental market, I doubt you'll find anything comparable at your previous rate. The second man, who'd remained silent until now, finally spoke. We've brought security personnel to ensure a smooth transition if you choose the vacation option. Security personnel. They'd brought muscle to intimidate a tenant into accepting illegal rent increases. This was moving from aggressive property management into potential extortion territory. I appreciate you coming by to discuss this, I said, maintaining my calm tone. Before I respond, could you give me a few minutes to retrieve some paperwork from my files? I want to review my lease terms and legal options. Harold nodded eagerly, probably assuming I was preparing to negotiate or surrender. Hoffman checked his expensive watch with obvious impatience, while the security contractors positioned themselves near the door like they were preventing an escape attempt. I walked to my home office, closing the door behind me. The filing cabinet in the corner contained the usual tenant documents, lease agreements, rent receipts, correspondence with Harold about maintenance issues. But in the bottom drawer, secured in a fireproof document box, were papers that would fundamentally change the evening's dynamic. I'd purchased the Meridian Towers building 8 months ago through Cascade Holdings, one of several shell companies I used for real estate investments. The acquisition had been part of a larger portfolio purchase involving 6 properties across the downtown district, financed through my engineering firm's substantial profits from recent construction projects. Harold had been struggling with building maintenance costs and falling behind on property tax payments. When Cascade Holdings approached him with a generous offer, he'd accepted immediately, though the sale terms included a management agreement that allowed him to continue operating as landlord while we handled ownership responsibilities behind the scenes. The irony was that Harold had been paying rent to my company for months while simultaneously collecting rent from tenants who had no idea about the ownership change. He'd signed paperwork acknowledging Cascade Holdings as the new owner, but apparently hadn't connected that information to his tenant Victoria Nash's actual identity. I pulled out the deed, property transfer documents, and Harold's signed management agreement. The papers clearly established my ownership of the building Harold was now trying to evict me from, using intimidation tactics that violated both his management contract and basic tenant rights. Returning to the living room, I found Hoffman examining my engineering certificates with obvious confusion. He'd apparently expected to find evidence of financial instability, not professional credentials suggesting substantial earning potential. These are impressive qualifications, he said, gesturing toward my structural engineering license. What exactly do you do for work? I design buildings, I replied simply, settling into my chair with the document folder. Now, about this rent increase. Harold leaned forward eagerly. Have you decided about the new terms? I've reviewed my legal position, and I have some concerns about your proposed changes. I opened the folder, placing the first document on the coffee table. This is the deed to the Meridian Towers building, filed with the county recorder's office 8 months ago. All three men leaned forward to examine the document. Harold's expression shifted from confident to confused as he read the property details. Hoffman's sharp smile faded as he processed the legal language. According to this deed, I continued, the building owner is Cascade Holdings LLC, which acquired the property from Harold Brennan in a transaction completed last March. Harold nodded slowly. Yes, that's correct. I sold to Cascade, but retained management responsibilities under a service agreement. Excellent. Then you'll recognize this document. I placed the management agreement on the table. Your contract with Cascade Holdings, specifying your duties as property manager and the limitations on your authority. Hoffman snatched up the agreement, scanning the text with growing alarm. The contract clearly outlined Harold's responsibilities and explicitly prohibited arbitrary rent increases without owner approval. Harold, I said gently, according to Section 12 of your management agreement, any rent adjustments require written approval from Cascade Holdings' authorized representative. Did you obtain that approval before tonight's visit? His face had gone pale. No, I thought. Hoffman said market conditions allowed. Market conditions don't override legal contracts, I continued. More importantly, Section 15 prohibits intimidation tactics against tenants, including threats of immediate eviction without proper legal notice. I placed the final document on the table. This is Cascade Holdings' Articles of Incorporation, filed with the state. You'll notice the authorized representative's signature matches mine. The silence that followed was profound. Harold stared at the documents, slowly connecting pieces he'd somehow missed despite signing them months earlier. Hoffman looked like he was calculating how quickly he could distance himself from the evening's activities. Your Cascade Holdings? Harold whispered. I'm the principal owner, yes, which makes me both your tenant and your boss, Harold. Though after tonight's performance, we need to discuss whether our management arrangement should continue. The security contractors had stepped back toward the door, clearly recognizing that their services were no longer required or welcome. Hoffman was examining his phone, probably searching for exit strategies that didn't involve legal liability. This is impossible, Hoffman protested. Property owners don't rent apartments in their own buildings. Why not? I wanted to live downtown near my work. This building met my requirements, and the apartment was vacant when I moved in. The fact that I later purchased the building doesn't invalidate my tenancy. I stood up, gathering the documents. Harold, your management contract included provisions for situations like this. Tomorrow morning, I'll need you to provide a written report explaining tonight's attempted rent increase and the rationale for bringing security personnel to intimidate a tenant. Victoria, I had no idea. That's precisely the problem. You had no idea who you were dealing with, what legal authority you actually possessed, or what consequences your actions might have. Hoffman finally found his voice. This whole situation is highly irregular. Property owners have rights that supersede tenant protections. Property owners have responsibilities that include following their own management contracts and respecting tenant rights, neither of which happened tonight. I walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline where several buildings bore my engineering signature. The irony of the evening wasn't lost on me. I designed earthquake-resistant structures that could withstand natural disasters, but apparently hadn't protected myself against landlord stupidity. Gentlemen, I think this meeting is concluded. Harold, please review our management agreement tonight and call me tomorrow morning to discuss how we prevent similar misunderstandings. Hoffman was already heading for the door, his property management services apparently no longer required. The security contractors followed without a word, probably relieved to escape what had become a legally complicated situation. Harold lingered, looking genuinely distressed. "Victoria, I'm sorry. Hoffman convinced me that aggressive management would maximize property values. I never intended to create problems for good tenants." "Harold, you've been managing this building for 3 years. In that time, have I ever been late with rent? Have I caused property damage or tenant complaints?" "No, never. You've been an ideal tenant." "Then why would you risk losing me for a theoretical rent increase that might not even be sustainable in the current market?" He sat down heavily on my couch. "Because I've been struggling financially. The building maintenance costs, property taxes, insurance, it's been overwhelming. When Hoffman showed me revenue projections with higher rental rates, it seemed like the solution to all my problems. I understood his financial pressures better than he realized. The property acquisition paperwork had revealed Harold's debts, deferred maintenance issues, and mounting expenses that had motivated the sale. But attacking stable tenants wasn't the solution to building management challenges. "Harold, financial problems require sustainable solutions, not quick fixes that alienate tenants and potentially expose you to legal liability." Over the following hour, we discussed the building's actual financial situation. Harold's management approach had been reactive rather than strategic, addressing problems as they arose instead of planning for long-term sustainability. Higher rental income was indeed possible, but through unit improvements and strategic marketing rather than intimidation tactics. "What happens now?" Harold asked as our conversation wound down. "Now you continue managing the building under our existing agreement, but with better understanding of your actual authority and responsibilities. Cascade Holdings will also provide additional resources for property improvements that justify gradual rent increases through normal lease renewal processes. And the Hoffman property management contract. I'd recommend terminating that immediately. Their approach creates legal liability without providing sustainable value." A week later, I sat in my apartment reviewing engineering plans while Harold knocked on my door again, this time alone, during normal business hours, and with a much more professional demeanor. "Victoria, I wanted to update you on the building improvements we discussed." I invited him in, noting his more relaxed appearance. The stress that had driven him to desperate measures seemed considerably reduced. "The property management contract with Hoffman has been terminated," he reported. "I've also scheduled consultations with contractors about the lobby renovation and elevator modernization projects." "Excellent. How are the other tenants responding to the improvement announcements?" "Very positively. Several have expressed interest in lease extensions once the upgrades are completed. No one's mentioned the awkward visit last week." I hadn't shared details about our unusual landlord-tenant-owner relationship with other building residents. Harold's learning experience didn't need to become neighborhood gossip. "Harold, I have a proposal that might interest you. Cascade Holdings has been considering property management expansion, and your building experience could be valuable for our other holdings." His eyes lit up with genuine interest. "What kind of expansion?" "We've acquired properties throughout the district that need experienced local management. The compensation would be significantly better than your current arrangement, and you'd have proper company support instead of operating independently." Over the next month, Harold transitioned from struggling individual landlord to regional property manager for Cascade Holdings' real estate portfolio. His intimate knowledge of building maintenance, combined with proper financial backing and legal support, transformed him into an effective property management professional. The Meridian Towers building underwent systematic improvements that justified gradual rent increases for new tenants while maintaining affordable rates for existing residents who had been stable, responsible occupants. My own rent remained unchanged, though I occasionally received building improvement updates from Harold in his capacity as property manager rather than landlord. 6 months after the confrontation that had started our complex relationship, Harold stopped by my apartment with coffee and the building's quarterly financial reports. "Victoria, I wanted to thank you for not firing me immediately after that disastrous evening with Hoffman. Everyone deserves the chance to learn from mistakes, provided they actually learn. I've been thinking about what would have happened if you'd been a normal tenant facing that kind of intimidation. Someone without legal resources or financial stability. It would have been devastating. Forced relocation, legal costs, potential job disruption. Exactly the kind of situation tenant protection laws are designed to prevent." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "I've implemented new procedures for all the Cascade properties. No rent adjustments without proper legal review, no intimidation tactics, and mandatory mediation for tenant disputes before considering eviction procedures." "How are the other property managers responding to the new protocols?" "Better than expected. It turns out that treating tenants with respect actually reduces management headaches and legal liability." Who would have guessed? We both laughed, recognizing the irony that basic human decency also happened to be good business practice. A year after the incident, I was reviewing architectural plans for a new downtown development when Harold called with an unusual request. "Victoria, I have a potential tenant for the penthouse unit who specifically asked about meeting the building owner. Apparently, they've heard about our management approach and want to discuss a long-term lease directly." "That's interesting. What type of tenant?" "A federal judge who's relocating to the city. She's been dealing with landlord issues in her current location and wants assurance about building stability and management practices." I agreed to meet with Judge Patricia Connors, curious about her specific concerns. The conversation revealed that she'd been researching downtown properties and had identified Meridian Towers as having unusually stable management and satisfied tenants. "I've seen too many landlord-tenant conflicts in my courtroom," Judge Connors explained. "Properties with ethical management practices are increasingly rare, and I'm willing to pay premium rent for peace of mind." "What convinced you that this building met your requirements?" "Tenant reviews consistently mentioned respectful management, prompt maintenance response, and transparent communication. Several residents specifically noted that they'd never experienced intimidation or arbitrary policy changes." Harold beamed with pride. The transformation from desperate landlord to respected property manager had clearly exceeded his own expectations. "Judge Connors," I said, "you'll find that our management approach prioritizes long-term tenant satisfaction over short-term profit maximization. We've learned that stable, respected tenants create more value than aggressive rent extraction." That's refreshing to hear from a property owner. After Judge Connors signed a 5-year lease for the penthouse, Harold and I reflected on how dramatically our building's reputation had improved. "You know," Harold said, "that night when I showed up with Hoffman and those security guards was the worst mistake I've ever made as a landlord." "And the best learning experience?" "Absolutely. I went from treating tenants as profit sources to recognizing them as community members whose satisfaction directly affects property value." "Harold, would you be interested in speaking at the Property Management Association's annual conference? Your experience could help other landlords avoid similar mistakes." He looked genuinely surprised. "You think other property managers would be interested in my story?" I think they'd benefit from understanding how ethical management practices create sustainable profits while aggressive tactics create legal liability and tenant turnover. 6 months later, Harold delivered a presentation titled From Intimidation to Integration: Building Value Through Tenant Respect to over 300 property management professionals. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several management companies requesting consulting services about implementing similar approaches. The presentation also caught attention from the City Council's Housing Committee, which invited Harold to participate in developing new landlord-tenant mediation programs designed to prevent aggressive eviction tactics. Victoria, Harold said after his first committee meeting, they want to use our building as a model for ethical property management practices. How do you feel about that level of public attention? Honestly, proud. 3 years ago, I was a struggling landlord making terrible decisions out of desperation. Now I'm helping develop policy solutions that protect both tenants and property owners. The committee work led to Harold being appointed to the city's Affordable Housing Task Force, where his combination of property management experience and tenant advocacy perspective provided valuable insight for policy development. It's ironic, he reflected during one of our quarterly building reviews. The night I tried to intimidate you into accepting illegal rent increases was the beginning of the most successful period of my career. Sometimes the biggest disasters become the most important learning opportunities. Though I still can't believe I brought security guards to threaten someone who owned the building. We both laughed, recognizing that the evening had been simultaneously Harold's worst decision and the catalyst for dramatic positive change in his professional approach and personal values. 2 years after our initial confrontation, Meridian Towers had become one of the city's most sought-after residential properties, with a waiting list for available units and rent rates that reflected quality rather than exploitation. Harold's management company had expanded to oversee 40 properties throughout the region, all operating under the ethical principles he developed through our unlikely partnership. Victoria, Harold said during our latest quarterly meeting, I have a confession. What's that? For the first 6 months after I learned you owned the building, I was terrified you were going to evict me as property manager. Why would I do that? Because I demonstrated such poor judgment and created legal liability for your company. I smiled, thinking about the journey we both traveled from that disastrous evening to our current successful collaboration. Harold, the best property managers are the ones who learn from mistakes, rather than repeating them. You've proven that ethical management isn't just morally right, it's also more profitable and sustainable than aggressive tactics. And you've proven that property owners can prioritize tenant welfare without sacrificing business success. Sometimes the most effective way to protect your investment is to treat people with respect and dignity, regardless of the power dynamics involved. Looking back, the evening when Harold showed up with security guards demanding triple rent was a perfect example of how assumptions can create catastrophic miscalculations. He'd assumed I was a financially vulnerable tenant who could be intimidated into accepting illegal demands. I'd assumed my role, as both tenant and owner, would remain comfortably separate. Both assumptions were wrong, but the collision between them created something better than either of us had imagined. A property management approach that demonstrated how ethical business practices could generate superior results while treating everyone involved with respect and dignity. Sometimes the best outcomes emerge from the most uncomfortable confrontations, provided everyone involved is willing to learn from the experience rather than simply defending their initial positions.